So welcome everyone. I'm Shelley Stahl from the American Geophysical Union. I'm really delighted to moderate today's seminar, Accelerating Science, Data Discovery and Interoperability. There are 8 societies that have come together to collaborate on this seminar series. Actually more than that, because some of them are federations. So I'm joined by AAAS Science, the American Astronomical Society, the American Chemical Society, American Meteorological Society, specifically their Board of Data Stewardship, the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, so IUPAC, and I know we've got some members online for that as well. The American Geophysical Society has been very active in developing good practices within our own publishing space, as well as sharing that with our membership. I'll put some links in the chat in a moment, but we have a data leadership program that I lead, and we also support the Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. And you're certainly welcome to explore the materials that we have, and if they're relevant to you, I'm happy to be in contact sometime later. So let me introduce to you our 2 speakers for today. I'm really excited about this seminar because it shows what really innovative thinking and collaboration can lead to as a benefit for our researchers when it comes to being able to discover, access, and use data. And these 2 speakers are just really demonstrate that incredibly well. So Michelle Heacock is our program officer and lead for data science, the National Institute of Environmental Health Science, their Superfund research program. This program funds grants that span basic molecular mechanisms of biological responses, from exposures to hazardous substances, movement of those substances through environmental media, detection technologies, and remediation approaches. The Superfund research program works to learn more about ways to protect the public from exposure to hazardous substances and informs the development of policies and interventions to improve public health. Our second speaker, Danie Kinkade, she's the director of the Biological Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office that's located in the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Danie's a former marine biologist with more than 20 years of experience managing oceanographic observational data. She's the president-elect of AGU's Earth Space Science Informatics section and has held numerous leadership positions to include the Council for Data Facilities, EarthCube, and serves as an investigator on several grant-sponsored cyber infrastructure-related projects. And I'll put this in the chat. She just had her most recent paper published this week, which is very relevant to our talk today. And if you could all stay on mute throughout both of our speakers, and then on the other side, we will moderate a discussion. If a question comes to mind, go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll help to make sure those speakers get to those questions. So Michelle, we're ready. Looks
okay, good. I think, Shelley, what's happening? Oh, you got it? Okay,
yep.
Perfect.
Yep, go ahead.
All right. So thank you so much for including me and giving me the opportunity to share with you what some of our grantees in the Superfund research program have been doing. I get the pleasure to talk to you on behalf of the rest of the Superfund staff, which you see here on the bottom of the slide. So here, let me just make sure. Okay, hold on. I was doing so well. I got a gold star from Shelley with my slide movement skills, and I think I just lost it. So just before we get started, I just wanted to make sure a couple key takeaway messages got through loud and clear. If not, please make sure that you ask me about them. So I just wanted to impress upon you that the activities I wanted to talk to you about today are data integration and reuse across a defined research program, and that defined research program being the Superfund research program, and you might hear me slip into saying SRP. Another key takeaway is we had data scientists collaborating with the researchers or subject matter experts, and what they were doing was collaborating with them so they could understand how the researchers were using the data to remove barriers to using the data by facilitating access. And I'll go into why that is in subsequent slides, as well as maximizing research potential. We certainly realize in the Superfund research program that data sciences is the next frontier, and we really see this as a key piece to being able to integrate data. And one other thing that came through these activities was training is critical. And the bottom is a disclaimer. So please know I am not a card-carrying data scientist. What I am is a program officer who has training in molecular biology and biochemistry. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of working with our researchers in the Superfund research program and on the part of program staff. This slide is just to show you that data sharing is important. This is the NIEHS is part of the National Institutes of Health. We are one of the 27 institutes. National Institutes of Health has a data science strategic plan. It's important across the NIH. It's important at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, where we have, as part of our strategic plan, a strong component for data science, in particular promoting translation data to knowledge to action. And of course, for the Superfund research program, which we are part of NIEHS, we also value the importance of data integration. So this is just an overview of what the Superfund research program is, or SRP. We are mandated under legislation, and we're mandated under 4 main mandates. And these are what Shelley had described to you in the introduction, just really trying to understand how a hazardous substance might reach a person and how that hazardous substance might elicit a health effect. Also, in addition to the typical biomedical research, Superfund also funds environmental science and engineering projects. So you can think of that as non-biomedical sciences. So ways to understand how contaminants are flowing through the environment, reaching other organisms. So just understanding how a given hazardous substance might bioaccumulate, as well as, importantly, ways to mitigate those exposures. So things like using microbes or plants to be able to break down those exposures so it's no longer bioavailable and people can't be exposed, as well as animals can't be exposed to the substances any longer. I say all that to really drive home this point on the right. What I have is to say we've got some pretty diverse science that we fund across the program to meet all of these 4 mandates. This is just the mainstay of our program. The bulk of our funding goes to fund what we call P42s, and that's just a way of classifying a grant that is a multi-project component grant. What is required in each of these P42s are minimum of 2 biomedical-based science projects, as well as 2 non-biomedical or environmental science and engineering projects. And these are all of the minimum of these 4 projects are meant to coalesce on a theme. So a given center might, for example, decide that they are interested in arsenic and they want to understand how arsenic exposure might be leading to the myriad of health effects that do occur from arsenic exposure. And on the non-biomedical side, they might be interested in understanding, well, how is arsenic getting into the water supply? What is that, those geochemical interactions that are governing that? And then also, what could we do to reduce arsenic exposures? The other part of the center, there's a lot of components that make these centers run smoothly and making sure that there is collaboration within the center. And I'm not going to go through all of these, not because they're not important, but just due to time constraints. I do want to point out that we have recently, over the last couple of years, required a data management and analysis core for each of these centers. We're on the way to all of these centers having this, but this is something that's brand new. But what I wanted to focus with you on today is some of the activities that we have funded to work towards making the data fair within the Superfund research program. And in particular, we went right for the I and the R. So we were going for interoperability and reuse. Important to note, this was for existing data, and I'll tell you a little bit about why we did it and what it was. So these are called external use cases. These were supplements that we provided to a center who applied. They were reviewed, and upon successful review, were awarded. And these were meant to spur collaboration among the programs. So another center collaborating with another center, bringing together two different data sets. And why we did this is we wanted to advance the science within the program. We wanted to be able to do that at the level of integration and reuse. We also wanted to understand, as program staff, what is needed in order to facilitate this. So through these use cases, we're learning more about what our researchers and grantees need. We realized that getting into this, there was a reality. There were advantages that we had. I hope I impressed upon you through that diagram that the center is structurally and scientifically integrated. So these researchers are used to a collaborative and transdisciplinary approach. So what we're asking them is, now let's do this at the level of the data. We also knew that there was challenges. Not all of them had data science expertise. Those data management and analysis cores, or DMACs, I might fall into saying that, they are just a recent requirement. So not all centers had that. So we realized we had to provide that expertise as part of the supplemental funding. We also realized that because of this, a lot of the researchers wouldn't be thinking about vocabularies, never mind ontology. So we realized we had to address some of those issues along the way with that. Of course, we've also, anticipating that data sharing is becoming something that is required, we wanted to make sure that our grantees had the repositories they needed, and to understand where there might be needs in the repositories that they needed to use to deposit their data for findability, accessibility, but also interoperability and reuse. And of course, the cost involved. And this is, of course, why we provided these supplements. So these use cases, importantly, we wanted the teams to be addressing a real world scientific driven question, not just to make data fair to make data fair. We wanted them to make data fair based on a research need that could be attained by doing that. I've already mentioned that they had to do at least 2 different data sets, and I've already mentioned that it was addressing interoperability and reuse. Importantly, we wanted to make sure, because staff wanted to learn more about what was required for the program to get towards I&R, and we wanted to share with the rest of the program the advances that these teams had made. We had made it a requirement for them to share their best practices and help identify the needs in data integration and reuse across the program. Of course, another reality is, gosh, not everybody was ready to integrate data right away. In fact, in some cases, there's no way we can do interoperability and reuse, but you know what? If we do things like getting data standards in place, we've got the potential to be able to make our data interoperable. And we valued the opportunity for them to do that, and we accepted that as this is something that is going to be a critical piece in order to move to I&R. I mentioned that there was some research questions, research questions that they had to address. I won't go through all of these, but I'll just maybe point out the first one that might resonate the best with this group. And this was a team that wanted to understand how they could do a better job at using plants to be able to pick up arsenic and other metals that were present in a mine tailing site. So mine tails were blowing from a mine site. into an area, and they wanted to use plants to be able to do that. So they wanted to bring together data sets that included, you know, the ion measurements within the soil, the microbial consortiums within the soils, as well as all of those were interacting with the plants. So you've just seen this slide, and this is just to show, yes, we realize that we span the gamut of readiness for data interoperability, and I'll just maybe point out this one here on the right, where this was one that we were really excited about. And Danie, you might recognize the players in this. They are from Woods Hole, and what they were looking at was trying to bring together two different data sets on killifish populations. One was exposed to PCBs, which is a hazardous substance, and another was PAHs, another hazardous substance. And I wanted to understand why exactly these fish were showing resistance. So they were trying to do this at the level of single nucleotide polymorphisms. And I'll show you how you can learn more about that particular use case at the end of this presentation. An important point to note here is that we didn't just award these and say one and done. We recognized that we needed to follow the progress, and we wanted to not have our use case teams to get stuck. So we held quarterly webinars along the way to have them give us progress on their activities. The idea, hopefully, again, is if somebody's having a stumbling block, maybe another team has a good solution to that. I wanted to highlight just two events that we held, and this was a mini workshop that was really looking at building a sustainable community of practice. And then the second one is that showcase, what we call the EUC showcase. So this is those teams bringing together different data sets and then reporting out on how they did. So this first workshop was looking at how do we build the sustainable community of practice. We knew that the external use case teams were going to be finishing up soon. We have these data management and analysis cores in place. How can we take advantage of this transition to really make sure we're capturing this momentum and keeping things going? So how we did this is we asked each of the roles to comment on what's needed to increase collaboration. How do we make sure that we're leveraging and sharing best practices from this particular activity, being the use cases? And we did this based on what does a data scientist think is the best way to do this, and what does the principal investigator, the researcher, the subject matter expert think is the best way to do this. And so here's some of the themes that were discussed. Generally, they agreed it is important to build a community in practice. It is important to share tools, make sure that they're available. They showed placed an importance on the value of training. Of course, issues making sure we have repositories that not only accept the kind of data, but accept the data with the metadata that's needed for the interoperability and reuse. Sustainable issues, of course, with the repositories, incentives for being able to do this because of time and cost burden. Ideas that they had, I won't go through all of them due to time, but things like maybe a centralized resource center so that the SRP grantees who are really looking at these 4 mandates for the Superfund research program have a place to go, and they don't have to sift through all of this knowledge that's across many different websites and databases. Another thing that they thought was a good idea is linking to protocols in the metadata, so demonstrating and showing how research was conducted. And this is really important, not only for reproducibility of a research finding, but also potentially for integration and reuse. The second event was an external use case showcase. This is where we had the external use case teams present on what they learned. And again, we had a spectrum of readiness for being able to combine their data. These are the themes that were discussed, and you are probably looking at this and saying, wow, these are really similar from that community of practice. And you're right. Things like challenges and needs for metadata standards, tool development, making sure we have those appropriate repositories, training, And one thing that wasn't specifically mentioned, but it was touched upon, and something that program staff was learning and appreciating the importance of, and I'm sure all of you understand this too, and that is if you've got data sets, that you've got a study, and the data sets are across different repositories, how do you best link them if somebody wants to be able to really understand how to reproduce that data? So for training, one key thing that we heard, and I'm sure this is no surprise to you, is that it's really important to make sure that training is across the gamut. You've got a lot of researchers who subject matter experts, they are established, but you know what? They're really frustrated because they do not have the data management expertise. So how do we get them on board? How do we empower them to be able to use the data? And these were things, ideas from the group were things like making sure we're training, making sure that we're providing visualization tools or platforms so that those people who don't have that data science savviness are now able to manipulate the data. Another thing that was brought up is a list of recommended training topics. So could we come up with, for Superfund research grantees, could we have a list of, here are the key training topics that this would give you, you'd be off to a really good start for understanding data science if you had these pieces. A need for data science term glossary, and gosh, you know, at the RDA web meeting a couple weeks ago, a nice glossary came up, as well as something that Shelley had shared with me, and I think Margaret O'Brien had a beautiful slide that showed the relationship between some of these terms. So I believe I'm going to reach out to her to see if she might be willing to let me revise that for our particular researchers. And then in particular, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Shelley. I feel like I might be going too much over, but I talked about some of these things, just a centralized resource center, things like an advisory board or peer group, working with other working groups. So this is where I'm real excited that you guys are here and getting to hear about some of the stuff that we're working on, because we understand, although we're a great closed system, we're all, as Superfund research program staff and grantees, we're concerned with these 4 mandates, but we also have to reach out to other groups. And that's because what we were finding in some of these use cases was that either there was a term that was missing, or there were things like tagging variables that have associated concepts in 2 different ontologies. So our researchers were, who are we to decide that this is the way it should be? So who do we reach out to in order to, you know, who's the gatekeeper, who's the curator of this, so that we know we're really kind of hitting this community, this is something that the community is going to embrace. And then just in red here, I have, you know, one of the solutions for this is NIEHS is hosting a metadata standardization ontology symposium coming up this year. So as we get more information on that, I'll be sure to share that information with Shelley. And then of course, this is where do we get input to keep things moving? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to be those, you know, no thanks, we're too busy. We really want to be able to reach out to those groups who can keep our momentum going. But at the same time, there is a lot to sift through. And I'm showing this on the right just to say, it's really, we've got a lot of diverse data. So this just makes it an exciting opportunity, not a challenge. And so with that, I just say thank you so much for inviting me. Stay tuned. We've got some publications coming out of these EUC report outs, a meeting report, and we also have an upcoming webinar series that is starting in just a couple of weeks. So I will be sure to put that to the chat, and I am going to turn this over to Danie. And I've stopped sharing.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see if I can start sharing here. There, and we'll expand that. Do you all see my screen?
It looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So thanks to Shelley and thanks for the rest of the societies for allowing us the opportunity to talk to you today. My perspective is going to be from an oceanographic repository and how we the practices and strategies that we use to accelerate science through data discovery and interoperability. And I'm speaking on behalf of my whole team at BCO-DMO, the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office. So I just want to thank you again for the opportunity. And as I talk to you today, it's going to be from that oceanographic research perspective. Going to talk a little bit about the challenges that are facing oceanographic research, how I see domain repositories fitting into maybe the solution space, talk about a few strategies that BCO-DMO uses, and then give one really pointed example, if there's time, on how we as a repository collaborated with an emerging research community to solve some of their thornier data sharing, access, and reuse problems. So oceanography, really heterogeneous and interdisciplinary to begin with by its nature. The data that we're talking about and that Michelle talked about are geoscience data. So just keep that in the back of your mind that these observations are unique in time and space. And so they're really hard. You can't really go back and resample them with the same expected results. And over the last couple decades, oceanographic research has been rapidly evolving, and the practices, the research practices and instrumentation have been keeping up this rapidly evolving pace. And what's happening is new complex data types of increasing size are getting created. And so as an example here, an emerging community in ocean metaproteomics, the study of proteins in oceanographic waters to inform knowledge of biogeochemistry. A single sample from a cruise can generate raw data files from mass spectra of terabytes or more. The instrument that you see on the right here is called an imaging flow cytobot. And this is capable of taking continuous high resolution samples of the microbial plants and animals in ocean water. And so this instrument contributes to a database that's growing over 1 billion images right now and more than 7 terabytes and growing. So highly heterogeneous, complex data types that are emerging and growing in size. This is compounded with the current culture of research in this information fragmentation. And Michelle alluded to this just a little bit. And I can maybe explain this through an example. Here is a research project, one project, collaboratively across 4 PIs who are interested in studying microbial life in the sediments of the seafloor. And they go on a research cruise. And they take different types of data. And when they're finished, those data, depending on what the type is, will go to a different repository. So the data associated with the cores that they took will go to a repository called EarthChem. But the metadata about the physical samples of the cores, well, that goes to a registry called CSAR. The water column data that they took, that comes to the repository I'm affiliated with, and so on. So all of these bits get fragmented from a single project. Once they're done with their analyses and they publish, well, that publication resides with the journal, in this case, Science. And if you wanted to know about the scholarly works of those authors, well, you'd have to go to a researcher registry called ORCID, and so on. So one project fragmented over a lot of destinations. And so what does that mean for the PI? Well, if you are the PI or the researcher who generated those data, you have to identify the repository and you have to organize and prepare and document those data to be shared. And that's sort of could be a whole nother webinar topic. But if you're somebody interested in that microbial sediment research, and you're interested in finding the data, you will have to piece together that research project by going to various repositories to find those data. A lot of times they're going to be obviously multiple sources, but in multiple formats, even though there may be some overlap of those data types, you're going to have to hope that there is enough metadata to both find and then understand those data to see if they're fit for your research purposes. And then if you are a technically savvy researcher building your own automated workflows, you're going to hope that that metadata and data are accessible in machine readable formats to drop them into your Python code. So a lot of challenges presented to the oceanographic researcher, right? And so here's where I want to present the idea, that domain repositories can help here. And this is a slide from Kirsten Leonard, who it depicts this sort of stepwise curation process and practices that can be applied to, say, PI's laptop data sitting there inaccessible and ill-described, right? Domain repositories have deep knowledge and expertise in their domains of practice. They know the data types, the standards and formats that are used, and they can apply these higher level curation processes like data harmonization and tracking provenance that allow those data to be discovered faster and used more effectively and efficiently. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to describe some strategies that the repository I'm affiliated with, BCO-DMO, uses, both for discovery and interoperability. And so BCO-DMO is just one repository in the US funded to work explicitly with oceanographic researchers to help them share their data. But in the process of that, we hope to improve those data for discovery and reuse. We do that, we call it adaptive data management. And I think what that really just boils down to is applying multiple data stewardship scenarios that are sensitive to not only where information and data reside, but how to describe them in a way that better aligns to the demands of the research community. So what does that mean for discovery? Discovery just kind of boils down to metadata and lots of metadata. And so as a repository, we collect metadata in a standardized way. We basically handhold the individual PIs who submit data with us to extract as much information as possible. We use domain expertise to validate that and even fill in the gaps. We make that data obviously human readable, attached to the data set that it describes. But more importantly, we publish it out in a variety of standardized, machine readable, internationally recognized formats. And what that does is aid in automated discovery. And it means that data aggregators or search engines and even the technically savvy end users who can hit our service endpoints can find the information and the data that they need and go. We also use things like persistent identifiers to link out to complementary or related resources and information. So for example, we will use the researcher identification ID, that ORC ID that I mentioned earlier, which is a persistent identifier. And we leverage those to provide more context about our PIs and the data that they have generated, but also to validate our own content. When two John Smiths come to our repository wanting to deposit data, we can sort of disambiguate them based on their unique identifiers. We also use identifiers for publications and linking publications to our data. So the publication DOI will be linked to the data sets and explicitly describe the relationship to that data. Were these publications describing the methods used, or was this a results paper? We also use this for our vocabularies. We use persistent identifiers to link out to accepted authoritative sources for things like our parameter names and our instrumentation names and even units. We're actually in the process of developing our own personal ontology based on all of these vocabularies together because our content is so heterogeneous. But this allows for accurate interpretation of data. Say if somebody's searching for something like high performance liquid chromatograph, and yet the PI submitted those data as my favorite chromatograph, we will map it to that known authoritative source. So it aids in interpretation and discovery of those data. So a couple of strategies for improving reuse and interoperability. We connect, like we connect to related metadata, we connect out to complementary data residing in other repositories. So the DNA sequences that are residing in the National Institute of Health's repository NCBI, we can link out to that and start to pull these disparate bits of data and information together for our end users. We also facilitate PI attribution and citation by providing a recommended citation of those data with the DOI and the licensing information. We perform gross quality control on all the data that comes in into the repository. We also harmonize those data wherever we can. For example, you'd be surprised at how many different ways the data point of time can be represented. Whether a PI submits that as a text string saying May 7th, 2021, or whether they submit it as Julian day or Gregorian day since 1900, we will convert that to a standardized community accepted format, in this case, like an ISO time. And what that does for our end users is it begins to allow them to integrate data in the catalog more quickly than if they had to convert all those dates together. So that's just one example. Lastly, we provide our data in a variety of community used formats, because we know that not every PI in every country will have access to MATLAB, and not everybody understands how to use NetCDF. We provide data in a wide variety of community used formats. And if you are that technically savvy end user and you are writing your analysis scripts and you want to sort of slurp in BCO-DMO data right away, well, then we provide the capability using some open source tools for you to build ingest queries for programmatic use. So you can just grab and go what you need. So these are just some of the strategies that we use at BCO-DMO to get at that shortening the time to science piece for researchers. And I think we'll have some time to just go into a real quick example of how we partnered with an emerging community to help them specifically with these issues. This is the ocean proteomics community. What you see here in the image down there, minus the 6 or so individuals who helped put on a workshop, is the entire ocean proteomics community in the US. It's a new and emerging domain for oceanography. It's the application of protein analysis to get at what types of organisms are in the water and look at what their cellular activities are in a way to inform biogeochemical cycling. So it's an emerging community, it's relatively new. All of these individuals have their own lab space. They all work on their own mass spectrometers, all of varying evolutions, if you will, which means that they produce data that are all unique to their lab. And yet they want to share this data across labs, and they haven't had a repository or a means of interoperating. And so one individual, the Sato lab, got a grant to solve this problem and partnered with BCO-DMO. And what you see here is the group that met in 2017, they came together to develop a best practices document on how to better share their data. And that further developed a data template, which BCO-DMO served as the data management expertise for. And that was backed by a model of what they needed, the minimum amount of information they needed to share their data across labs and what formats it should be in. Once those process data conformed to that, they could be pulled into BCO-DMO and then served through the tool that they later developed. But one really interesting note is that they wanted a piece of minimum information for them was the connection back to a cruise that sat at BCO-DMO. And that's because they needed all the environmental water column data to interpret their protein results. So we further worked with this grant to help them develop this tool. This is the Ocean Protein Portal, and it allows these proteomics researchers to discover protein samples throughout the global oceans and interrogate them, visualize them. And then when they need to interpret the results, there's a link back to the BCO-DMO repository where they can discover and use all of the other data sets that are associated with that particular cruise. So it allows them for the interpretation of those data. So this is just one example of how repositories can provide value to the research community through collaborative development. And in this case, we improved this community's ability to share their data and then discover that and reuse that data. So that's really all I have for you. As I leave, I just want to sort of plant the seed with you all that domain repositories can fill a niche in this space of accelerating science by doing the heavy lifting of data management. And that allows the scientists to do their science more efficiently and effectively. The practices that they apply improve discoverability and use of those data. And it means that a scientist shouldn't have to know anything about an ISO metadata record in that standard, but they should be able to locate the data that they need, determine if it fits their purposes, and use it effectively and efficiently. So that's all I have. I really appreciate you taking the time and listening to me today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Danie, and thank you, Michelle.
Absolutely.
This is so exciting. So I'm excited because you're demonstrating to a broad community that these collaborations, the ability to work across different types of data, different types of science, different types of missions, can benefit researchers and be an incentive for wanting a community like this to support them if they don't have one, or maybe ideas for existing communities on how they could further support their researchers. So if anybody has questions, please, you can either put your hand up or type it in the chat, and I'll try to do a good job watching for that. Danie, thinking about something you and I talked about previously, one of the challenges we have with researchers generally is encourage them to share their data at all. Michelle leaned in on this, on the fact that she has discovered data management training gaps. I think broadly we all realize that that's an issue, but you and I were talking about what would be the incentives for researchers to work with repositories like yours? How do we engage them in the research life cycle to include? I mean, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that.
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I mean, so and I'll be in all transparency and honesty. BCO-DMO is funded by the National Science Foundation primarily, and we have worked closely with our funders to, I wish it were the carrot that I could present, but really, kicking off this culture of data sharing, NSF has both used the carrot and the stick, right? And so they actually have a requirement that folks who are funded by the National Science Foundation's Oceanography division must share their data in one of their recommended repositories, of which BCO-DMO is one. And we try and make it as painless as possible. And we really kid glove the folks who come to us who have never had to share their data before. And so we try to make the process as easy as it can be. But then, we present some information on the benefits of sharing your data, right? Not only do you increase your collaborations, but once those data are out in the wild, described with a DOI, they're going to get used. You're going to get cited and attributed more readily. And so, that's the current, that's the current carrot. But there's also appealing to the sort of altruistic side of creating this community resource for not only your research, but policy and education. And it goes on to inform, larger things than just your particular project. But I would love to hear other folks, carrots out there. I'd be really interested in hearing that.
And let me go over to Michelle, and something that was really interesting observing the process that Michelle's taking with her teams is they're still challenged with the right repositories, and let me see if I can change my view. There we go. Okay, the right repositories uh, in order to direct your researchers. And Michelle, I wonder if you could talk about, that in specific. Would you benefit maybe from a conversation with a repository community to see what's possible, perhaps?
I think, yeah, that would be wonderful. And I think that's the reality is there needs to be some coordination kind of all along the way. Our goal was kind of a lofty one, just reaching far for the interoperability and reproducibility, but also with the right repositories comes the ability to report properly what is needed in order to be able to have that data interoperable or reproducible. One thing that surprises us when we saw it, but then it's almost embarrassing that it surprises you, is just the fact of including a link to the specific method that was used. Because I think for us, we were very, honed in on, let's make sure that the data can be leveraged. But it also is really important on that other side of it is to be able to reproduce that data. And sometimes it's just not possible to reproduce the data just based on the methods you see in a publication. You do need that extra granularity. So those kinds of things too. So just the right repository, domain specific one obviously is perfect, but then layered onto that extra metadata that would be needed. And then if you're going to a generalist repository, is there some way to, linking that the metadata maybe has its own DOI that you could link to, especially with some of these larger studies where you are going across different domain-specific repositories for a given study. But to reproduce that, how would you know that this data set is part of a larger study? So just making sure that proper annotation.
Yeah, and that's a challenge I've heard from a number of researchers over the years is, I've got this really complex work, and if I place the data in all the right places, how do I find it again? And I think highlighting the importance of those persistent identifiers and the work that Danie has clarified. Danie, here's a question for you. Linking all of those data sets together, from the ORCID to you didn't mention R2R, Rolling Deck Repository, so that's another one. CSAR and BCO-DMO. Are those two-way communications? Like no matter where somebody finds the data, will they be able to figure out where all the other pieces are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the fact that you called out R2R, the rolling deck to repository, is what accepts the data that comes off of the ship as it's steaming through the ocean, not necessarily the instrument packages that go over when this ship is stopped at any station, but that comes off the ship and goes to R2R. And we've had a really successful relationship with R2R, and we can generate two-way links with repositories, but it doesn't always happen. So for example, not to pick on NIH or anything like that, but NIH, big repository. We are not, and so we can make those two-way links, but we don't really quite approach the relationship with something that large to have reciprocal linkages. So the community that we serve, the Oceanographic community, can come to BCO-DMO and find these complementary data sources, but not necessarily. Now, R2R is a great example of when we do collaborate tightly, but not necessarily some of the other repositories, unfortunately.
So an opportunity.
It is an opportunity, yeah, definitely. Creating these sort of loose federations of repositories so that it doesn't necessarily matter where the entry point is. You can discover a lot of resources is really the way, at least the repository space wants to move, for sure.
There's Alicia has a question here about, and for either of you to answer, are you able to interact with researchers at the time of the data management plan development and what kind of challenges are you running into?
Yeah, I don't know about Michelle, but I'm happy to start there. BCO-DMO does offer services to help researchers develop their data management plans before they submit their proposals. We've even collaborated with the National Science Foundation's program managers in oceanography to generate a template for those researchers who are applying to the NSF for funding. And so it will have all of the key pieces of information that are needed in a data management plan that will pass through on proposal review. And then we also harvest those as they're funded on the other side. The successful proposals, we keep the data management plans publicly accessible, attached to their project information, so that it's sort of a manifest of what to expect from that research project in terms of the data types that they'll produce. So we've had luck there, but primarily in that National Science Foundation funded lane. I don't know how many other folks are using those templates for other funders, but we do have resources, and we always are happy to help generate a data management plan for a proposal.
Can I just foot stomp on what you just said? First of all, your funder directs those funded researchers to BCO-DMO, as opposed to the researcher trying to figure it out. So that has been, I think, a really important element for funders to figure out what are the actual repositories supporting their researchers, and then directing that work there. And then the second thing that's another foot stomper is you actually can then have a relationship at the time of data management plan development where you can ensure all of the elements are in there that make sense for that data.
Definitely.
And that's another unusual.
It gives the repository a heads up for what's coming to prepare for those data. Oh, I see that you're producing sequences. We're going to have to ask you for those sequence accession numbers so we can find them and link them. It also helps us help them. So we can say, oh, you haven't identified here where you're going to submit your core samples, and we know that those data should go to this repository, so we can help direct them as well.
I think that's huge. Michelle, I know that's not quite where your progression has gotten to you, but I'm wondering if you're thinking about more specific, identifying of repositories.
Yep. So for the data management plans, part of the role of the data management and analysis cores, which we required in those center programs, half of them have it, the other half should have it real soon, is part of their role is they have to have a data scientist and a librarian on board, and their job is to work with each of the projects and cores to develop their respective data management plans, as well as the comprehensive data management plan. The idea is we hope that by them doing that before they start collecting the data then gets into has a better chance, better position for integration down the road. What we don't have, Danie, and what you just said is such a nice thing, is that consultation where you're looking at an aspect and saying, gosh, you're missing this piece. What we've tried to do as a program is just comb through where we've seen examples of data management plans and provided them for our grantees. But that is something we're actively working on. We do have regular meetings with the leads for the data management and analysis cores. But yes, it is definitely a work in progress, and we've got some work to do in that realm.
Shelley, can I call out one thing in the chat? Is that okay? So I was just looking at Amy Nurnberger's comment about academic libraries can help in this space as well, in this consultation space. And I would absolutely say yes, wholeheartedly. And I want to call out that BCO-DMO sits at the Oceanographic with the institutional library there that helps us in so many ways. There's such a fantastic resource. So if you don't have a domain repository, or even if you do, this is just an additional resource at your disposal to help with that type of guidance. And I just want to call out also a comment earlier. Now I'm just scrolling up willy-nilly here, but in addition to the templates for data management plans, we're also collaborating with the community to develop, like that proteomics community, a submission template that helps folks with the minimum amount of information that we need for a particular data type. So if you're just wanting to submit bottle data that came off of one of the instrument packages on a cruise, we will provide you, well, hopefully soon, we will provide you with the data template that says the minimum amount of information you need to have in that file to share it. And we can generate these for either communities like the proteomics community or a specific data type. So that's one place that repositories can help as well.
Oh, that's incredibly valuable. I mean, we're really struggling, I think, broadly with a lot of researchers that, especially at the time of publication, that just want to do a check mark. Give me a DOI for this data. Data is probably not going to be reusable because there's no metadata there. I think there's an opportunity for everyone within the research lifecycle to try to help clarify for the researcher what it means to actually document their data, no matter what repository you land at. Let's see, I'm heading back to the chat.
And Shelley, as you're looking through the chat, Danie, I might just ask you, that sounds like a wonderful resource, having that submission template. And this is one thing that we're struggling with is how can we, we don't want to reinvent the wheel if something's already done so very nicely and we could just leverage what's already there. So is that something that is publicly available where we could point our researchers to be able to use that, or is that something that's just kind of built into your system?
Well, I don't think that the template has been published out yet, like in a informatics or a science journal. But for oceanography, there is a publicly accessible registry for best practices that something like this could go into. I don't think that this community has done that yet. But it's a great avenue to go discover things. Now it's obviously domain marine oriented, but you can find things like that, protocols and best practices for analyses, methodologies, types of things. But in the future, we hope to have those. So this proteomics one is kicking off our data template. And we haven't exposed that yet, but we hope to, definitely from BCO-DMO. And I just don't know if they've published that yet as the community. But yeah, eventually that's something, there's no need to have these behind a community wall. They're freely usable. And as a matter of fact, the more people that use that template, the more interoperable the data out in the wild will become, right?
There's a really interesting conversation happening in the chat supporting what you just said, Danie, that there are efforts coming out of the data curation network. And I do know of another effort, consortium of libraries within Europe that's also preparing curation protocols for specific data types. And there's also, of course, the metadata catalog from RDA. And I'm wondering if there's like a conversation that we need to have to try to start connecting the dots between those. One more shout out to our librarians who are truly there to catch all of the questions coming from our researchers, and really very grateful for their expertise. So yes, thank you so much. And we have several of them in our group here, which is really delightful. All right, we are coming up to the top of the hour. Laura, if you wouldn't mind sharing we can do a quick promotion. So thank you both to Michelle and Danie. This has just been incredibly insightful. And I hope there's more conversation that we can continue to foster and make available the information that's here, and we'll put the slides out, we'll put the recording out, and we'll also put out the chat with all of the links and information. So it seems like we're looking at the National Institute for Health as a deep dive on this session and the next. That just was serendipitous. Forgive me if it looks that way. But the new data sharing policies that have just come out, and there's some additional add-on opportunities. Susan Gregorick is going to speak to us about that from the National Institute of Health. I'm really excited about it. And then from our own collaborator community, Frank Krause and Yvette Seeger from the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, they are working with Susan as a society, a federation of societies, in order to help their members move towards being prepared for when those data sharing policies are enacted. And this is, real boots on the ground. How do you help the researcher directly as a society? And I'm really excited that this set of speakers is coming up for June 4th. So thank you to everyone, and have a lovely weekend.